Thank you very much, Tom, for that engaging and insightful speech, and for opening up the debate of this evening in such an interesting way. Speaking first in opposition of this motion is Ward Wilson. Ward Wilson is the fellow and director of the Rethinking Nuclear Weapons project at the British American Security Information Council. He's published a book called 5 Myths About Nuclear Weapons, which was met with great acclaim, and we're grateful that he's joined us from across the pond today. Thank you very much, Ward Wilson.
Thank you. The statement that nuclear weapons have made the world safer is, on its face, false. Adding nuclear weapons to the world makes nuclear war possible. A nuclear war would reasonably be estimated to kill 250 million people. Adding the possibility of nuclear war to the world obviously makes the world more dangerous, not safer. The only way that nuclear weapons make the world safer is, if they can do some good, like increase stability, and at the same time, the dangers they pose can be avoided with 100% certainty. If nuclear weapons do some good, but also eventually touch off a nuclear war, then the world has not been made safer. The only way nuclear weapons make the world safer is if it can be shown that the dangers they pose can be avoided. Let's look at 2 of the most severe dangers and see if there are convincing arguments that they will not occur. It's frequently said that because there hasn't been a war between great powers since nuclear weapons arrived in 1945, that nuclear weapons prevent great power wars. So that's the first risk we'll examine. Can nuclear weapons prevent wars between great powers? And it's often said that nuclear deterrence is a system that has been stable for many decades, and therefore that it can nuclear deterrence is a system that can reliably prevent nuclear war. So let's look at deterrence second. So, wars between great powers. Unfortunately, the belief that nuclear weapons can prevent wars between great powers is no more than wishful thinking. It's often said that the 78 years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki have passed without a single conflict between nuclear-armed great powers, and that is certainly so. But the nature of human beings makes any claim that wars between great powers can be avoided forever extremely unlikely. The hold that war has on us is far stronger than we are usually comfortable admitting. Examine the history of our civilization, what Winston Churchill once called that dark, lamentable catalog of human crime. And you will clearly see that human beings have deep-rooted urges to make war. It is not, let me keep going for a sec. It is not pleasant to make this point, but the stakes involved require that we be brutally honest with ourselves. We have been fighting wars with dogged persistence for at least 6,000 years. Every era of history and region of the world has experienced war with disheartening regularity. There are sometimes pauses and respites, sometimes for even as much as 100 years, but war is a savagery that only sleeps. The American philosopher William James explained the persistence of war in this way: our ancestors have bred pugnacity into our bone and marrow, and thousands of years of peace won't breed it out of us. If humans were to suddenly give up fighting wars, it would be a revolution in human nature. Overcoming our urge to make war would be like losing our predisposition for religion, our love of beauty, our tendency to overeat. The belief that nuclear weapons can prevent war between great powers is basically a belief that human nature has been changed overnight by these weapons. This sounds suspiciously like the claims that idealists make, that human nature can be overcome if we just wish for it hard enough and we just believe it with all our might. Trusting that human nature can change overnight is not a realist's argument. It is an optimist's argument, an idealist's argument. But nuclear weapons have not changed our natures. The heretofore unquenchable desire for unbridled war has not now been tamed forever. No matter what nuclear weapons advocates optimistically claim, nuclear weapons do not ensure that our darker, primitive natures will never again overwhelm our sensible, rational selves. There's no doubt that the risk of using nuclear weapons can restrain thoughts of war, some of the time. But can the magic of nuclear weapons dissuade powerful and determined leaders from clashing forever? What advocates of nuclear weapons ignore when they point to the 78 years without a war between great powers is that that total only amounts to 1.3% of the evidence. The other 5,922 years tell a different story. Sadly, nuclear weapons have not transformed our warlike natures into calm and peaceful ones. Unbridled war, fought with savage abandon, is still likely, perhaps even inevitable. If you doubt that nuclear-armed states can come to blows, let me remind you that the United States is currently a hair's breadth away from being directly involved in the war in Ukraine, and it appears to be making plans for war with China over Taiwan. People in the United States certainly think great power war is coming. An International Red Cross survey of millennials asked Americans if they thought a worldwide war like World War II would happen in their lifetimes. More than 58% said yes. And this was in 2019, before the explosion of the Ukraine war and the war in the Middle East. The belief that nuclear weapons have made wars between nuclear-armed states impossible is no more than a dangerous fantasy. All the evidence of our history and everything we know about ourselves tells us that our warlike natures cannot change overnight. That is the sound of realism talking. Which leaves nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence can fail, has failed, and will fail. Nuclear deterrence has failed in the past. In 1948, when the US had a monopoly on nuclear weapons, it didn't deter Stalin from risking a blockade of Berlin, which could easily have led to war. In 1950, when the United States moved nuclear-capable bombers to Guam and then leaked news of the move, that didn't deter China from joining the war in Korea. Everyone knew that Israel had nuclear weapons in 1973. It had been reported in the New York Times. But that didn't deter Egypt and Syria from launching a war against Israel. And in 1982, Britain's nuclear weapons didn't deter Argentina from attacking and briefly capturing the Falkland Islands. Nuclear deterrence has failed repeatedly in the past. Sure.
I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, but I'm sympathetic. I just have a question. None of those cases involve existential threats, is a great concern. Do you think that makes a difference or not?
I don't. Would you argue that the United States is unable to defend Hawaii with its nuclear weapons because it's a distant island far from the central part of the United States? Would you argue that an enemy of the United Kingdom could bomb smallish towns with nuclear weapons because they aren't essential to the existence of the state? I think a nuclear attack is a nuclear attack. Let me go on. So the failures, which is not to say that nuclear deterrence cannot and will not work. There's no question that nuclear deterrence works some of the time. The problem with nuclear deterrence is that in order to be safe, it has to work all the time. It has to be perfect. Even a single failure could lead to a vast and destructive war. Nuclear deterrence will inevitably fail because it has a crucial component built into it that can fail catastrophically, that has a history of failure. And that component is us, human beings. Human beings are fallible. Not just frontline soldiers, leaders as well. No one's perfect. I'm not perfect. Are you perfect? Human beings play an essential role in nuclear deterrence. Human beings make the threats, and other human beings evaluate them and decide how to respond to those threats. Nuclear deterrence isn't a machine that runs quietly in the corner. We are integral to the process. So if human beings are prone to folly, and we are, and if human beings are involved in nuclear deterrence, and we manage every step, then nuclear deterrence is, by definition, inherently flawed. It will fail repeatedly. One day our luck will run out, and we'll end up in a devastating war. It's not a question of if. It's just a matter of when. It is not realism to rely on a process that will eventually result in a catastrophic war. Nuclear weapons make the world more dangerous. It is not possible to completely rule out the possibility of nuclear war. Therefore, any objective, realistic assessment must conclude that nuclear weapons do not make the world safer.